Welcome to Communists of America. Today, we're going to be talking about the assassination of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson and the suspect of that killing, Luigi Mangione. We want to say right off the bat that this is all alleged. We don't know whether or not Luigi did it, and we're not really going to talk about that. But we are going to talk about Luigi as being a center of this case and the support that he has gotten for being at the center of it. And we do want to say that if you do support Luigi, definitely hit the join link below to get organized, to build a revolutionary party, and harness the energy that you share with a lot of people. We have Charlotte Papin, who wrote an article about Luigi and mass consciousness. So what is the mood towards Luigi as far as what do the masses think about this killing and Luigi?
There's been a lot of an outpouring of support for Luigi on social media, and I think it's been a topic of discussion amongst people's friends at their workplaces, in their classrooms. There was a New York Times opinion piece written that was called "The Rage and Glee That Followed a CEO's Killing Should Ring All Alarm Bells." And this journalist said that, quote, "I've been studying social media for a long time, and I can't think of any other incident when a murder in this country has been so openly celebrated." But I think it's very clear why there's been this reaction and this outpouring of support. In another poll, more than 2/3 of people who responded said that they believed denials of coverage and the profits of the healthcare industry were at least partially responsible for the killing.
I hate to say his name on the podcast, but Ben Shapiro found out the hard way that this is not a left-right divide issue. He made a video called "The Evil Revolutionary Left Cheers Murder." And a lot of the people in his fan base, in the comments, actually, if you look at the comments, said this is not a left issue, it's everybody. His audience as well didn't really have sympathy for Brian Thompson and his assassination.
Exactly. It's not a left-right issue. And to quantify it a little bit, a YouGov poll revealed that 39% of adults under 30 view Luigi favorably. That's a huge section of the youth in particular, but there's a support for him across a wide age range and also across the political spectrum. This is not a Democrat-Republican issue. It's a class issue.
Both parties are the party of Brian Thompson. Donald Trump, right after the killing, said that
was a terrible thing. It was cold-blooded, just a cold-blooded, horrible killing. And how people can like this guy is... that's a sickness, actually.
And this is across both of the ruling class parties. Tim Walz, I think he tweeted something like, "Brian Thompson was a valuable part of the healthcare community." I mean, basically, the entire ruling class has closed ranks in order to condemn the shooting of Brian Thompson and call Luigi a terrorist and all of these things. Luigi is facing federal charges of murder with a firearm, stalking, and state charges that he's pled not guilty to of terrorism and first-degree murder. He faces the possibility of a life sentence without parole if convicted, and I believe the federal charges carry the possibility of the death penalty. And it's not just him. A working-class Florida mother of 3 was denied insurance by her provider, and on the phone, she ended the call saying, "Delay, deny, depose, you people are next." This is a desperate person who has just been denied insurance, and now for just saying those words, she's facing 15 years in prison.
Yeah, this reaction from the ruling class is actually radicalizing a lot of people who consider themselves on the right, maybe. We have a comrade in Tennessee who said that their brother, who's an active duty Marine, was a Trump voter, was an Elon Musk fan. Because of this killing became a Luigi supporter. And because of the reaction from the ruling class, people like Trump, people like Elon Musk, now this person who was a Trump voter adopted the communist label and said that their brother is posting social media posts that have the Internationale in the background of them. So I think that's radicalizing people. And I think an even bigger layer of people is radicalized because of the hypocrisy. The same ruling class that is reacting against this killing is also killing people all over the world.
All of this stuff about condemning violence and stuff is coming from the same class of people that are sending billions to Israel to fund the slaughter of the Palestinian people. I mean, the Israeli state, for months telling the Palestinian people one place is safe, to go to it, move there, and then bomb it, and then say another place is safe, go there and then bomb it again. That's mass terrorism. They have absolutely no ground to stand on. They condemn violence in general, but there's blood all over their hands. They are doing that abroad, while inside of the United States, if you look at data from the American Journal of Public Health, you can estimate that 7,100 Americans died from a lack of health care in the time between the shooting of Brian Thompson and I think early February. It's completely hypocritical. The US healthcare industry is particularly brutal and exploitative, and it touches almost every single American workers' lives. There was some research done on this recently that said 18% of insured adults said that they'd experienced a claim denial in the last 12 months. That's a huge chunk of the adult population. Across all medical insurance companies, 1 in 5 claims were denied. And what does that mean? That means that people don't get access to the healthcare that they desperately need. In some cases, people dying due to lack of access to healthcare. Or even if you're able to get care, then a lot of people end up in crushing medical debt. 1 in 12 adults in the United States have medical debt. But if you take into account healthcare debt that is on credit cards or owed to family members, then it's actually 41% of the adult population in the United States that has medical debt, and most of that amounts over $10,000. So the American workers are being absolutely crushed by this, and the reality of this means that people face losing their homes, having to cut down on spending on food, on childcare, on the basic necessities of life. Meanwhile, United Healthcare's annual revenue is $215 billion. There is absolutely all of the technology, all of the money, all of the resources that is necessary in order to have everyone have access to healthcare in this country. But we have a profit-driven system.
All of these people that got denied a claim, that means that they paid for the insurance and then did not get the service that they were expecting. And of course, people like Brian Thompson were leading the companies that were denying all these people their healthcare claims. So it's not surprising that people don't have a lot of sympathy for people like him, especially with that $215 billion revenue. But this is not just about healthcare, right? It's coming at a time when people can't afford groceries right now. Eggs are very expensive. I mean, this isn't just healthcare, right?
Yeah, it's not just healthcare. Since the beginning of the pandemic, grocery prices in particular have gone up 25%. And meanwhile, people's wages have not gone up 25%. It is harder and harder for working class people in America to make ends meet. And I think there's a general feeling of discontent about the economy, but about the state of things under US capitalism in general. And I think it's manifesting in a lot of different ways. There was a recent Gallup poll that found that less than a third of people under 30 in the United States trust the government. So all of this hatred towards the CEOs, this hatred towards Brian Thompson, that extends to the US government, because ultimately these US politicians, they're ruling in the interests of that class of people, in the interests of the healthcare CEOs and the billionaires. So it's clear why there would be all of this support for Luigi. You have Luigi, who is marched in front of cameras, surrounded by cops, trying to make a statement about it. Well, Netanyahu, who the ICC put out a warrant for his arrest for crimes against humanity, war crimes, he's treated as, an honored guest. The reality is that they don't oppose violence in general. It's just that they want to have a monopoly on that violence through the police, through their institutions, and they don't want it to be used against them.
A lot of people were noticing the hypocrisy of the big perp walk because the mayor, Eric Adams, was behind Luigi, formerly of the New York Police Department, which has a $13 billion budget to basically oppress New Yorkers. I mean, this is a violent organization that he presided over, violence that they're even proud of. U.S. imperialism chooses which violence that it supports, which one it's proud of. In the case of Syria, for instance, they support what they call maybe freedom fighters or militants, whereas usually they would call people like that maybe terrorists or extremists. So basically, I mean, there's like the ISIS that they like and the ISIS that they don't like, depending on what their interests are. in the situation.
When there was the Palestine encampment movement earlier last year, there were Zionist thugs that attacked the encampment in LA, and the police just stood by and let them. And now they've arrested Mahmoud Khalil for basically the crime of being a mediator for the encampment. So yeah, it's just complete and total hypocrisy.
How should we as Marxist communists understand the phenomenon of Luigi, the phenomenon of the political situation that's developing? Because I feel like if this happened 10 years ago, there wouldn't nearly be, anything close to the amount of support.
I think that's exactly it, right? If this had happened 20 years ago, I don't know that there would have been all of this sympathy and celebration, And I think it's because there's an underlying process that's happening, that living standards have declined, that people have seen nothing but economic crisis with 2008, 2020, the pandemic, have lived through the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is a process of radicalization that is happening. And the shooting of Brian Thompson was essentially, it was an accident that expressed this deeper process that was happening, this necessity. It didn't create this class anger. Day-to-day life under capitalism has created this anger towards the CEO. But what it did is that it revealed it.
Yeah, this CEO killing was not the only individual act to come out of this rage and injustice last year. We saw at the beginning of the year, Aaron Bushnell self-immolated in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., in response to the genocide in Gaza.
Life under capitalism is producing a layer of people that are extremely angry, and they're looking for answers. They're looking for a way out of this crisis, and there's no one able to point the way forward.
Yeah, and this vacuum is not just producing people that commit these individual acts. You could say that the personality of Trump was able to take advantage of that political vacuum as well.
I think Trump is another accident expressing that underlying necessity, in that he is able to basically to tap into that mood to say that, yes, that things are in decline and that something needs to be done. And he's made promises that he's going to bring down inflation and bring back the glory days of capitalism, which is, of course, totally false. But at least he's offering answers, you know what I mean? He's making promises. Meanwhile, the Democrats are defending the status quo. So, that's absolutely another consequence of the political vacuum. And I think that we're going to see more examples of this as things progress. I think there are going to be other individuals or phenomena that do tap into something like that, tap into that developing class consciousness, the rage that people feel. One day they're going to be nobody, and then the next day they're going to be somebody with a platform. And as Marxists, how do we relate to that kind of thing? We want to connect with what's progressive, with what's positive about that, while also, if there's criticism, maintaining that, and ultimately pointing the way forward, that what we need is a fight against capitalism and a fight of the organized, united working class in order to overthrow capitalism and establish a workers' government and socialism, and that at every step of the process, we want to point that way forward.
These conclusions that we're presenting don't come out of nowhere. Ultimately, we are a continuation of the traditions of the Russian Revolution, of Bolshevism, that went through its own learning process. Lenin went through his own learning process through the experience of Narodnism. For people who don't know much about that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Definitely. I think it's a really useful historical example to look at, because it wasn't just one individual act of terror. It was developed into an entire system in Russia. To go back and give a little historical context, in the early to mid 1800s, there was all of these peasant uprisings against this massive suffering, basically. And on the basis of that, on the threat of revolution, there were some reforms granted with the intent of staving off unrest, basically. And the serfs nominally gained their freedom, but in reality basically remained crushed under massive debt and just were totally impoverished. I think you can definitely see some similarities to the situation now, where today there's this not just medical debt, but also credit card debt, all of this that is weighing down on American workers. And it was in this situation that the intelligentsia, sort of young radicals, they were also looking for a way out. And because capitalism in Russia developed later, the working class at the time was very small, and it was a mostly peasant feudal society. So very naturally, they looked to the people in general, the peasantry, as the revolutionary force in society. These people were very self-sacrificing. Many of them gave everything up in order to go into the villages and to try to spread revolutionary propaganda. They actually got a pretty cold response, and this movement ended up going into basically two different directions. One wing went in kind of a liberal gradualist direction, the idea of like small deeds and reforming things. Well, on the other side, a terrorist wing developed, which espoused the idea of the propaganda of the deed, which is basically the idea that an individual act, like the assassination of a czarist official or the czar himself, could basically rouse the masses into revolt. One of the leaders of Narodnaya Volya put it this way: history moves too slowly. It needs a push. Otherwise, the whole nation will be rotten and gone to seed before the liberals get anything done.
This quote sort of reminds me of what the mood is right now, that the liberals can't get anything done. And that might push people to want to just get anything done, like do something now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people probably feel similarly to that quote. And it can manifest in different ways, not just the shooting of CEOs, but also other forms of like direct action, throwing soup on paintings, or, chaining yourself to a tree. But I think we have to ask ourselves in a sober way, what do these things achieve? And the reality is that these individual acts like this, they don't rouse the working class. And usually they're pretty disconnected from the broader working class movement. And the reality is that no individual act, whether it's individual direct action or even the other side of that, individual sort of good deeds, is going to be able to take down the capitalist system. And we need to channel that energy in an organized way into a party that can sink roots into the working class. And when there are movements that arise that can channel that energy towards the overthrow of capitalism. And that's the most important thing that we need to be focused on right now. Looking back at the Narodniks is really useful for this. In 1878, Vera Zasulich, a Russian revolutionary, attempted to shoot a police chief who was treating prisoners in a particularly brutal way, had ordered the whipping of one prisoner for the crime of like not standing up when he came to visit the detention center. It was essentially a revenge killing. There was a lot of popular support for this. She became kind of a folk hero, a little bit like Luigi. But that support, it was a passive support. It was a passive sympathy. Individual acts of terror, at best, they might receive that kind of passive sympathy, but it doesn't help the working class see their role in society. It doesn't help the working class understand that because of their role in production, in producing everything in society, that they have the power to stop production, to take things into their own hands and transform society and run it themselves. And ultimately, that is what we are in favor of. We are in favor of all tactics that increases the self-confidence, unity, and class consciousness of the working class. And individual terror does not achieve that. And so we do not support methods of individual terror or other kinds of individual acts that are less maybe extreme, like direct action and those kinds of things.
A lot of people might be uncomfortable criticizing these methods, like it somehow denigrates the memory of these people who sacrificed a lot. But I think that Lenin's experience, his approach to it, is a really good example, because his brother, actually, Sasha Ulyanov, was executed for taking part in a conspiracy to kill the Tsar. They didn't really even get that far into it, but even for considering it, for taking a part in it, was executed. Even despite that and his brother's memory, and of course the way that affected him, as Lenin got involved in the movement in his own way over the years and learning what the consequences and the results of these methods, he fought against it. He argued against it. I mean, his first book, What the Friends of the People Are and How They Fight the Social Democrats, was against these very methods, the same methods that his brother was involved in that got him killed. But there was no sentimentality about that. I mean, it was just sober, looking at the facts, looking at the conclusions. Did this furnish us good results? And he concluded that it didn't.
He wasn't the only one. Vera Zasulich, she actually, because of all of the support that she had, actually got off and she fled to Europe. And she actually went on to help found the Emancipation of Labor group, which was the group that brought Marxist ideas to Russia and provided basically the ideological basis for the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which the Bolsheviks eventually came to run. So she realized that this was not the path forward, and that was what was necessary was the ideas of Marxism.
Plekhanov and Axelrod, two people that were at the beginning of Russian Marxism. Plekhanov brought Marxism into Russia. They had to go through this process of learning to develop the tactics that would be successful for the revolution. And ultimately, the biggest success story of all of this is the Bolsheviks and Lenin, who had to go through this process of arguing against these methods, winning people over, and finding the best tactics.
Bolshevism was born basically out of a struggle against the methods of individual terror and anarchism, amongst other things as well. In Where to Begin, Lenin said the following: individual terror diverts the most active fighters from their real task, the task which is most important from the standpoint of the interests of the movement as a whole. The immediate task of our party is not to summon all available forces for the attack right now, but to call for the formation of a revolutionary organization capable of uniting all forces and guiding the movement in actual practice and not in name alone, that is, an organization ready at any time to support every protest and every outbreak and use it to build up and consolidate the fighting forces for the decisive struggle. And I think this puts it very well, because I mean, it's clear that Lenin didn't want any less to struggle against the system. He fought his entire life to overthrow Tsarism and capitalism in Russia, and ultimately led the Russian Revolution to victory. And the workers and peasants did come to power in Russia. But what he was pointing out is that what was necessary was to overthrow the entire system. And he also had massive confidence in the working class, and that the working class would move, and that it was the working class, due to their role in production, that was the revolutionary force in society. And I think behind individual terror methods is a lack of confidence in the working class and that they will move. And we also have immense confidence that the working class is going to move. I think we saw a taste of that in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement, with 10% of the adult population out on the streets. And I think we've seen the massive potential that was revealed with the shooting of Brian Thompson, all of the class anger that is simmering underneath the surface. We know that this will cause people to move at some point. We can't say exactly when, but our task now is to prepare ahead of time, to gather our forces so that basically we can be prepared as possible for when that does happen, to bring the movement as far as possible, because ultimately we need a united, class-conscious working class around a revolutionary program that goes at the heart of things, at capitalism.
Yeah, and we're not waiting around. We are doing something right now. That's building the Revolutionary Party, which you should join, by the way. We are building from coast to coast. We're talking to people at protests, talking to people on picket lines, trying to build this party, because without a party to collect all that class anger and direct it, I mean, it's going to dissipate. Trotsky said that this was like a steam engine. Steam by itself will just dissipate into the air. It needs a piston box to direct that. That's what we're trying to build, and that is the most pressing task, because you can't do anything without it, and it hasn't been built. That is what we're doing right now.
Yeah, and I think the reason why we talk about the Narodniks is because there is a counterexample, which is the Bolshevik Party. And because the Bolshevik Party was built, then the Russian Revolution was successful, and the Russian working class and peasants did end up taking power. And if you want to learn more about the history of Marxism in Russia and the building of the Bolshevik Party that culminated in the successful Russian Revolution, then you should read Bolshevism, The Road to Revolution by Alan Woods, which is available at marxistbooks.com. There are other historical precedents for this as well. The Luddites, they preceded the Chartist movement in England, which was the first working class movement ever. But the Luddites, their jobs were being replaced by machines, their livelihoods threatened, and in retaliation, they took matters into their own hands. They smashed machines, destroyed the property of the capitalists. And I think these were basically the tactics of a movement in its infancy that preceded a much greater revolutionary wave. And in the Chartist movement, there were general strikes. They created the first class independent party And there was, at its height, there was attempted insurrection. So, and those are lessons that are extremely relevant to us today, to the need for class independence. Anarchism has been a widespread thing in the past. I mean, even here in the United States, President McKinley was shot by an anarchist sympathizer, the president that Trump loves to idealize.
All that may be true. People might be saying, yeah, well, I understand that. But it seemed like maybe this killing scared CEOs. I mean, if we kill enough CEOs, won't that just scare them into giving us what we want? Is that true? Is that going to work?
A comrade of ours in Minneapolis, his grandma at the dinner table expressed something along the lines of, I hope that they just keep shooting CEOs because eventually something's got to give. And that's very telling of the mood in society. But the reality is that individual acts are not going to scare the capitalist class into granting concessions. In particular, if you look at the healthcare industry, there were reports of a bunch of CEOs wanting increased security. There are also reports of increased police presence around different CEOs' homes. And the Narodniks in 1881, there was a very, quote, successful act of individual terror. They assassinated the Tsar. And in reaction, there was a wave of repression, basically living under essentially a dictatorship. That's what that achieved. So I think that a string of assassinations, it would not scare the capitalists because it does not threaten their system ultimately. No individual act can, but what it would do, it would mean a crackdown, not just on the perpetrators, but probably on the left in general, an increase of repression in general. But I think a lot of people are asking themselves, the question behind this is, what would it take in order to reform the US healthcare system, in order to improve things? For all of the reasons we've outlined, the Revolutionary Communists of America, we do not support individual terror. It's essentially totally counterproductive. But that doesn't mean that we can't take on the capitalist class. But the power of the working class, it comes from its numbers, that the working class makes up the vast majority of society, and from its role in production, that it produces all of the goods and services in society, that it makes things run. But in order to exercise that power, that needs to be exercised collectively, which is why we are in favor of methods like strikes, which they do shut down production and they hit the capitalists where it hurts, which is their profits. But through that process, the working class is able to essentially realize their role in society and the power that they do wield, and it increases class consciousness, essentially.
With all that in mind, what is the effect on the working class of individual terror? What are the outcomes of it?
If you look at some of these tweets that have been circulating about, hoping for another shooter, something like that, I think you can see that it relegates the working class to a passive role. You know what I mean? It makes, even if people sympathize, they're waiting around for another individual hero to take on the capitalist system, as Trotsky put it, in single combat, which we just discussed is doomed to fail. So it does not increase their own confidence or class consciousness, and it does not help the working class see themselves as part of a massive class of people. I think it's revealed anger, class anger and rage at the system, but I think that's not quite the same thing as class consciousness. Class consciousness is understanding, yes, I'm a worker and I'm oppressed and exploited, but also that I'm a part of a vast class of wage laborers that have the same interests as me, class interests. I think it can also, individual terror can have other negative effects. I think in a lot of cases it can alienate people, and it actually reinforces the media propaganda, the lies that communists or that revolutionaries, they're evil people who want violence, who are ruining society. And that's why, for example, cops will plant agitators in protests and try to get protesters, activists to do essentially individual acts of violence or property destruction or that kind of thing in order to confuse the movement and send it down a different channel. From another side of it, if you look at Trump and the reaction to the attempted assassination of Trump, the first one is that it has allowed him to rile up his base, you know what I mean, and say they are after me, you know what I mean, they are coming for me. I'm sure you watched the inauguration speech. He said that I was saved by God, in order to carry out this mandate. And it basically allows him to play that kind of messiah card. And we already talked about also the potential increased repression and crackdown on the movement in general, which they will take any excuse to do. So for all of these reasons, you know what I mean? The Revolutionary Communists of America, we do not support individual terror. We actively struggle against it in favor of mass direct action. That's what a strike is. It's mass direct action, but it's not shutting down production that is necessarily the key thing there. It's that the workers are doing that collectively, and through that experience, learning of their revolutionary role in society, their ability to take matters into their own hands, ultimately to take power from the capitalist class, because they are a tiny minority. The reality is that the working class is the vast majority of society, produce everything in it, but has to realize that power in order to take it.
Yeah, and this criticism isn't coming from like a moral place. It's coming from a place of wanting to find the best tactics to furnish us those results that you talked about the working class coming into their class consciousness and realizing their power. I think that Trotsky says it the best here in this quote from Why Marxists Oppose Individual Terrorism. He says, "If we oppose terrorist acts, it is only because individual revenge does not satisfy us. The account we have to settle with the capitalist system is too great to be presented to some functionary called a minister or a CEO. To learn to see all the crimes against humanity, all the indignities to which the human body and spirit are subjected as the twisted outgrowths and expressions of the existing social system, in order to direct all our energies into a collective struggle against this system, that is the direction in which the burning desire for revenge can find its highest moral satisfaction." So you already touched on this a little bit, but if not individual terror, if not these direct actions, what is it going to actually take to change the healthcare system?
I think first we should look at the reality of what we are up against. US healthcare spending reached $4.9 trillion in 2023, and it accounted, healthcare spending in general accounted for 17.6% of US GDP the same year, which is a huge, massive industry. We're talking about billions of dollars here, and the capitalist class is not going to give any of that up out of the kindness of their heart. It's going to have to be wrested from them, essentially. And the idea of single-payer healthcare, of the state providing healthcare, is actually pretty popular amongst American workers. Amongst the public, 63% of US adults say that the government has the responsibility to provide healthcare coverage for all. This was a statistic back from 2020. This is something that many people would support. But we're living through essentially the decline of the capitalist system. And so from the point of view of the capitalist class, they need to squeeze the working class more to extract as much profit from them as possible. And so they're not just going to give up these things sort of out of the kindness of their heart. It's going to take real struggle in order to win this. In the post-war boom, the capitalists could afford, when their system was booming, when it was doing well, they could afford to give some more crumbs to the working class. And also that the wages of the working class, or at least not entirely, but a layer of them, were actually high enough that they could pay for health insurance. And so this was not sort of a burning question the way that it is right now. And if you look at, for example, the NHS in Britain, their nationalized health service, that also came about in the post-war era, when it was essentially, this was totally bankrupt and it was nationalized. And now you're seeing that there are being cuts to the NHS, that there are being privatizations. So it's also important to understand that the nationalized healthcare that some other advanced capitalist countries like in Europe do have, those weren't just given. They came out of a different time, and they were also a product of struggle. They were hard won. And also, as we're seeing now, all of those reforms that were won are being rolled back. So we would also say that we are certainly would be in favor of any kind of reform to the US healthcare system, but we also understand that as long as those reforms stay within the limits of capitalism, that they can ultimately be rolled back. But even just to win significant reforms, it is going to take serious class struggle. What scares the capitalists is a threat to their system. It would be a mass movement that threatens to paralyze capitalism and threatens to replace it with a workers' government. It would take a movement that is armed with the program that would get at the heart of these things, that would draw the link between the state of US healthcare and capitalism. And I think that on that basis, on the threat of the potential of revolution, could serious reforms be won.
We're not just guessing that this would happen. I mean, this is the way that the 8-hour workday was won, how weekends were won, and even how Social Security was won through the struggle that they gave us Social Security to basically stave off revolution.
In the 30s, there was massive class struggle. There were huge. The industrial workers were getting organized. The CIO was formed. There was huge class struggle. It was on that basis these reforms were granted, as well as trying to dig themselves out of the hole of the Great Depression and save their system from revolution temporarily.
Yeah, and just to illustrate how serious the ruling class thought this was, FDR was told by somebody that if the New Deal worked, then he would end up being the best president that ever existed. FDR said, yeah, and if it doesn't work, then I'll be the last president. And so that's how serious it was. But to go back to talking about revolution, a lot of people might say that you talked about how you oppose violence, but isn't revolution bloody? That sounds like, you're bloodthirsty and you want a violent revolution. Is that true?
Absolutely not. Communists are not in favor of violence, and we do not want a violent revolution. I think we have to look at society today. It's the working class, makes up the vast majority of society. They make everything run. It is the capitalist class, who is a tiny minority, who they have a monopoly on violence. They are the ones who are committing violence through their system, and then also through explicitly through their institutions, the police, the military, all of these kinds of things. And the working class actually has every interest in taking power peacefully and the ability to do so. The working class has no interest in violence. It's the capitalists who use it against the working class, who use it against working class movements and to defend private property. So we're absolutely not in favor of violence, but we're also not pacifists, We absolutely support the working class's right to defend itself against attacks from the capitalist class.
Yeah, and just to go back to the Russian Revolution, that's a great example of this. The revolution itself in October was pretty peaceful, and it wasn't until after the reaction of the capitalists and the imperialists from other countries actually invaded that there was massive amounts of violence. The death toll from that is the fault of the imperialists that came in. In fact, the U.S. was a part of these invasions. And if you want to learn more about that, you can read it in Colossus, our book by John Peterson, and that is at marxistbooks.com. So we talked about strikes, Revolutionary Party, the masses taking control, taking matters into their own hands. This might all sound like this is not possible in the United States, but we are confident that this is possible. Why?
Well, every single day, we're talking to people on the streets who are sick of this system. They want revolutionary change. They want to do something. They are just looking for a way out, a way to do that. I think just talking to my own friends and family, there's a deep discontent with society. And Luigi also, I think, showed this with all of the massive sympathy that he got. But this is also materializing in polls. 45% of Americans identify as working or lower class, according to a 2024 Gallup poll. That's a huge section of society who says, yes, I'm working class, I am a worker. Another 53% of Americans identify as middle class or upper middle class, which is actually down from an average of 61% before the 2008 financial crisis. So while it's still a significant portion of the population, this isn't a linear process. That number is going down. More Americans are considering themselves workers. Support for unions is at basically an all-time high. Meanwhile, trust in most institutions like Congress, the justice system, all of these has plunged. So I think all of this shows the direction that things are moving in. So I think that we have every reason to be optimistic, and we're heading towards a period of massive social unrest and ultimately of revolutions. And so the question is what to do. And what we need to do is to act now by building the party that can harness and channel all of that anger and rage when it bubbles to the surface.
And if you want to build the party to overthrow capitalism in our lifetime, join the Revolutionary Communists of America. We are building such a party from coast to coast. Our comrades are in cities all over the country, hitting the streets, organizing people who feel the same way that you do. If you want to be a part of that, join us at communistusa.org/join.